carriage door was ripped open before it even stopped moving, and Celine Marlowe was pulled out into the cold night air by two guards who did not look at her face even once. She stumbled on the stone steps of Blackthorn Castle, her wedding dress dragging through mud that had no business being near a royal entrance. Somewhere above her, torches burned along the tall black walls, and somewhere behind those walls, a king was waiting who had already decided he hated her. She had been married that morning to a man she had never met. The ceremony lasted less than 10 minutes. There was no feast, no dancing, no gathering of packs to celebrate the union. There was only a priest reading words from an old scroll, a ring pushed onto her finger by a hand that did not linger, and a signature scratched onto a treaty that had bound two kingdoms for 200 years. Alpha King Draven Ashworth had not even looked at her during the vows. He stared at a point somewhere past her shoulder, as though she were a piece of furniture being delivered rather than a bride being received. Now, hours later, she stood in his courtyard while rain began to fall, and no one had told her where she was supposed to go. "Move," one of the guards said, his voice flat, uninterested. He gripped her arm hard enough to bruise and pulled her toward the castle doors. Inside, the halls were lit with cold blue light from crystal lanterns, and the ceiling stretched so high above her that she felt like an insect crawling through a giant's home. Servants pressed themselves against the walls as she passed, none of them meeting her eyes. She had expected fear from a strange new place, but she had not expected this particular kind of fear, the kind that came from being looked at like a threat. She was taken up a spiral staircase that seemed to twist forever, past floor after floor, until the air grew thinner and the windows grew smaller, until finally the guards stopped in front of a heavy door bound with iron. One of them unlocked it, the other shoved her inside without a word. The door slammed shut behind her, and she heard the lock turn. The room was not cruel in its furnishings. There was a soft bed with silk sheets, a fireplace already lit, a wardrobe filled with dresses finer than anything she had ever owned. A tray of food sat on a table by the window, untouched, steam still rising from it. If she did not know better, she might have called it a comfortable room. But there were no handles on the inside of the door. The windows, when she rushed to them, were sealed shut, and far below she could see the courtyard she had just crossed, tiny now, guarded by 4 men who never seemed to look away from the tower. She was not a guest. She was a prisoner. Celine sat on the edge of the bed and pressed her hands together to keep them from shaking. She thought of her old home, the small cottage at the edge of the Marlowe lands, where her grandmother used to braid her hair by candlelight and tell her stories about kings and omegas and bonds that could shake the world. She thought of the woman who raised her, old Agnes, who had taught her strange customs that no other omega in the Packlands seemed to know, customs about bloodlines and packs, and a throne that was older than any king who sat upon it. Agnes had died 3 months ago, taking most of her secrets with her, leaving Celine only fragments, half a story with no ending. She did not understand why any of that mattered now. She was simply a bride nobody wanted, locked in a tower by a husband who had not spoken a single kind word to her. A sound at the door made her sit up straight. The lock turned, and the door opened, and there he stood. Draven Ashworth filled the doorway the way storms filled the sky, dark and sudden and impossible to ignore. He was tall, broader than any man she had seen, with black hair pushed back from a face that might have been handsome, if it were not so cold. His eyes, when they finally landed on her, were the color of steel, sharp and searching, as though he were looking for a weapon she might be hiding. "You will stay in this tower," he said. No greeting, no apology for the guards, the locked door, the mud on her dress. "You will not attend court. You will not walk the grounds without my permission. You will not speak to my advisors, my soldiers, or my people." Celine rose to her feet, forcing her spine straight even though her legs wanted to shake. "I am your wife," she said quietly, "not your enemy." Something flickered in his eyes, gone before she could name it. "You are a stranger, placed in my house, by a treaty I did not choose," he said. "Your pack is disgraced, your bloodline unremarkable, and yet the old agreement demands I take an Omega bride from your family, or lose the support of 3 border packs who still honor that scroll. I did what the treaty required, nothing more. Then let me prove I am no threat to you, let me out of this room. No." The word came fast, sharp, final. "Until I understand exactly what you are, You remain here, where I can control you." "What I am?" she repeated, confusion pulling at her voice. "I am an Omega from a small pack. I am nothing more than that." His eyes narrowed, studying her the way a hunter studies a trail that does not quite make sense. "Perhaps," he said, "or perhaps you are exactly what my enemies would send me, wrapped in silk and given a pretty face, to sit inside my walls and wait." "Wait for what?" He did not answer. He turned, his cloak snapping behind him, and walked out, and the lock turned again, and Celine was alone with the fire and the untouched food, and the terrible silence of a room that was, in every way that mattered, a cage. She did not cry. She had promised herself on the carriage ride here that she would not give this castle her tears. Instead, she walked to the window and looked out at the kingdom spread below her, the rooftops of a city she was not allowed to visit, the mountains beyond that she was not allowed to see up close, and she wondered what kind of man could look at a frightened stranger and see only danger. Days passed in a rhythm that never changed. A servant girl named Elsie brought her meals 3 times a day, always glancing nervously at the door, as though she were breaking some rule simply by speaking. Celine learned quickly that Elsie was kind but terrified, that she had been warned not to grow close to the new bride, that even small kindness in this castle came with a cost. "Why is he so afraid of me?" Celine asked one morning, as Elsie set down a tray of bread and fruit. Elsie's eyes darted to the door. "The king is not afraid of anything, my lady," she whispered, "but he trusts even less. There was a time, before he became king, when someone close to him betrayed his family. He has not let anyone close since." "Who betrayed him?" Elsie shook her head quickly. "I have said too much already." She hurried out, and the lock clicked, and Celine was left to turn the small piece of information over in her mind, like a coin she could not spend. She began to notice small things about her prison. The guards changed shifts at dawn and dusk. The fireplace was fed by a servant who came while she slept, meaning someone could enter the room without her waking, which meant the door was not always locked as tightly as she believed. She found a loose stone in the corner of the room, behind the wardrobe, that rattled slightly when she pressed on it. She did not know what was behind it, but she filed the discovery away, a secret in a place that offered her nothing else to hold on to. At night, she dreamed of Agnes. In the dreams, the old woman sat by a fire, much like the one in this tower, and spoke in riddles Celine could never fully catch. "The blood remembers, even when the mind forgets," Agnes would say, over and over, her voice echoing strangely. The throne was never his alone to keep. Celine always woke from these dreams with her heart pounding, unsure whether they were memories of things Agnes actually said, or simply her mind trying to make sense of a life that had turned upside down in a single day. On the 7th day, Draven visited again. This time he did not stand in the doorway. He walked fully into the room, and Celine watched him take in every detail, the untouched dresses still hanging in the wardrobe, the plate of food from that morning barely eaten, the window she had clearly spent hours staring through. "You are not eating," he said, and for the first time, his voice held something other than command. It almost sounded like concern, though she suspected she imagined it. "There is little appetite for food when a person does not know if she will ever leave a room," Celine said. He was quiet for a long moment. "The tower is for your protection, as much as mine," he said finally. "Protection from what?" "From people who might use you against me," he said. "From people who might use me against you. This kingdom has enemies who would like nothing more than to find a weakness in my crown, and a new bride, unknown and unproven, is exactly the kind of weakness they look for. Then explain that to me instead of locking me away like a criminal," she said, surprising herself with the steadiness in her voice. "I am not a fool, Your Majesty. I understand danger. I understand caution. What I do not understand is cruelty disguised as caution." His jaw tightened. For a moment, she thought he might turn and leave again, the way he always did when a conversation grew too honest. Instead he walked closer, close enough that she could see the faint scar along his left eyebrow, close enough to smell the cold mountain air still clinging to his clothes. "You do not know what it is to sit on a throne that everyone wants to take from you," he said quietly. "You do not know what it is to trust someone and watch that trust become the blade that nearly ends you." "No," she agreed. "I do not know that. But I know what it is to lose everything I understood about my own life in a single morning. to be handed to a stranger, to be locked in a tower by a husband who looks at me like I might strike him at any moment. If you want honesty from me, Your Majesty, you must be willing to offer some in return." Something shifted in his expression, a crack in the ice that had covered his face since the moment they met. He did not answer her. He simply looked at her for a long moment, as though seeing her clearly for the first time, and then he left, and the lock turned, and Celine sat by the fire and wondered what exactly had just happened. That night, she pressed on the loose stone behind the wardrobe again, working it free with careful fingers. Behind it was a small hollow space, empty except for a thin layer of dust and a single carved symbol scratched into the stone itself, a symbol she recognized instantly because Agnes had drawn it 100 times in the dirt outside their cottage while telling her stories. It was the mark of the old pact, the same one etched into a ring Agnes had given her before she died, a ring Celine had hidden in the lining of her travel bag and had not dared show anyone since arriving at the castle. Her hands trembled as she pushed the stone back into place. She did not understand what it meant that this symbol was hidden inside her prison, carved by hands unknown, long before she ever arrived. But she understood, with a certainty that settled cold and deep in her chest, that nothing about her arrival at Blackthorn Castle was as simple as an unwanted political marriage. Somewhere far below, in the depths of the castle, a man who called himself her enemy sat awake long into the night, staring at a fire of his own, unable to explain why the frightened, defiant Omega locked in his tower had settled into his mind like a splinter he could not remove. He told himself it was suspicion. He told himself it was the careful instinct of a king who had learned, through betrayal, to trust nothing and no one. He almost believed it. But beneath that careful, practiced suspicion was something else entirely, something he refused to name, something that had stirred the moment her eyes met his in the courtyard and had not settled since. He thought of the way she had stood her ground in front of him, unafraid despite everything, demanding honesty from a king who had given honesty to no one in years. He did not know yet what she carried within her blood, what secret the old pact had hidden inside her family for generations, waiting for the right moment to surface. He did not know that the woman he had locked away out of fear was, in truth, the very key to the throne he was so desperate to protect. All he knew was that for the first time since he took the crown, he found himself thinking of someone other than the enemies at his gates, and that thought unsettled him more than any threat ever had. Outside, the wind picked up over Blackthorn Castle, rattling the tower windows, carrying with it the scent of rain and the distant sound of wolves calling to each other across the mountains, as though even the wild things sensed that something old and long buried was beginning, slowly, to wake. Elsie arrived earlier than usual the next morning, her tray shaking slightly in her hands, and Celine knew at once that something had changed. "The king has asked that you be permitted an hour in the garden," Elsie whispered, setting the tray down quickly. "Only the garden, only with guards watching, but it is more than you had yesterday." Celine stared at her, certain she had misheard. "An hour outside this room?" "Yes, my lady. Please hurry and dress." He does not like to be kept waiting, even for orders he gave himself. Celine dressed faster than she had in days, choosing a simple green gown from the wardrobe, rather than the heavier silks meant for court. When the guards unlocked her door, she felt a strange mix of relief and wariness, as though she were being led into a trap disguised as kindness. Still, she followed them down the long spiral stairs, past floors she had never seen, until at last they stepped through a side door into open air. The garden was smaller than she expected, tucked between two high stone walls, but after a week in a locked tower, it felt enormous. Late summer roses climbed along a trellis near the far wall, and a small fountain trickled quietly in the center, surrounded by neat rows of herbs that smelled faintly of mint and lavender. Celine walked slowly, savoring the feeling of grass beneath her shoes, the warmth of real sunlight on her face, the simple, overwhelming freedom of open sky above her, instead of a ceiling she had memorized every crack of. She was not alone for long. A man in fine dark robes approached from a side path, his steps unhurried, his eyes sharp with quiet calculation. He was older than Draven, with silver threading through his dark hair, and a face that seemed permanently arranged into polite neutrality. "Lady Celine," he said, bowing his head slightly. "I am Cassian Voss, advisor to the crown. I do not believe we have been properly introduced. No, Celine said carefully, we have not. The king rarely allows new arrivals into the garden so soon, Voss said, his eyes studying her, with an intensity that made her skin prickle. You must have made quite an impression, my lady. I made no impression at all, she said. I simply asked to be treated like a wife instead of a prisoner. Voss smiled thinly. A reasonable request, though I suspect the king's caution runs deeper than simple distrust of a new bride. He paused, glancing toward the guards stationed at the garden's edge, then lowered his voice. Tell me, my lady, where does your family trace its bloodline? Your pack records were unusually difficult to find. The question caught her off guard. My family has always lived at the edge of the packlands, she said. We were never important enough for detailed records, Lord Voss. Perhaps, he said, though his tone suggested he did not fully believe her. Still, there are old stories in this kingdom, older than the current treaty, about bloodlines that matter more than any pack's wealth or title. I find myself curious whether you have heard any such stories yourself. Celine thought immediately of Agnes, of the symbol behind the loose stone, of dreams filled with riddles about blood remembering what minds forgot. She kept her face carefully still. I know only the stories every Omega child is told before sleep, my lord, nothing more. Voss studied her a moment longer, then inclined his head. Of course. Forgive my curiosity. It is simply a habit of my position to wonder about everything, especially things that do not quite fit the pattern I expect. He bowed again and walked away, leaving Celine standing by the fountain, with her heart beating far too fast. She did not trust him. There was something in the careful way he asked his questions, something that suggested he already suspected an answer, and was only testing whether she would confirm it. She resolved, then and there, to guard her secrets more carefully than ever, even here, even in a garden that was supposed to feel like freedom. Her hour ended too quickly. The guards escorted her back to the tower, and the door locked behind her once more. But something had shifted. She had breathed fresh air. She had spoken to someone other than a frightened servant girl, and she had learned that at least one man in this castle was watching her far more closely than she had realized. Draven visited again that evening, later than usual, his expression unreadable as he stepped into her room. You met Voss, he said, not a question. He introduced himself, yes. What did he ask you? Celine studied him carefully before answering. He asked about my bloodline, my family's records. He seemed disappointed that I could tell him so little. Something tightened in Draven's jaw. Voss has served 3 kings before me. He is brilliant, and he is loyal, but he is also a man who sees conspiracy in every shadow. Do not let his questions frighten you. I am not frightened of questions, Your Majesty, she said. I am frightened of a kingdom where everyone seems to be searching for something in me that I do not understand myself. He was quiet for a long moment, watching her with an expression that had softened slightly since the harsh coldness of their first meeting. What do you mean? She hesitated, unsure how much to reveal. Agnes had always told her to keep the old ways secret, to speak of them to no one outside the bloodline. But something about the exhaustion in Draven's eyes, the weight he seemed to carry every time he entered this room, made her want to trust him, just a little. When I was young, she said slowly, the woman who raised me taught me things other Omegas were never taught. Old customs, old symbols. She always said our family carried something important, though she died before she could explain what that something was. Draven's eyes sharpened with sudden focus. What kind of symbols? Before she could answer, a horn sounded somewhere far below, low and urgent, echoing through the stone corridors of the castle. Draven's head snapped toward the door, his entire body going rigid with alertness. Stay here, he said, already moving. Lock the door behind me, and do not open it for anyone but Elsie. What is happening? Trouble at the eastern gate, he said, already halfway out the door. Stay away from the windows. He left before she could ask another question, and Celine stood alone in the sudden silence, her heart pounding, wondering what kind of trouble required a king to abandon a conversation so suddenly, and wondering, with a chill she could not quite explain, whether that trouble had anything to do with her. She did not sleep that night. She sat by the window, watching torchlight move along the distant walls, listening to the faint sound of raised voices carried on the wind, until finally, near dawn, the commotion quieted, and the castle settled back into an uneasy stillness. When Elsie arrived with breakfast the next morning, her face was pale, her hands trembling worse than usual. "What happened last night?" Celine asked immediately. Elsie glanced at the door, then leaned close, her voice barely above a whisper. "Someone tried to enter the castle through the servants' passage near the eastern wall. A stranger, my lady, dressed like one of our own guards, but he was not. The king's men caught him before he reached the main halls." "Caught him doing what?" Elsie's eyes were wide with fear. "Asking questions, my lady. About you." Celine's blood ran cold. "About me?" "Yes, my lady. The guards say he wanted to know which tower housed the king's new bride. He never made it past the second floor before he was stopped, but—" Elsie trailed off, glancing nervously toward the window, as though the stranger might still be listening somewhere in the walls. "The king has doubled the guards on this tower. He has also asked that you not leave your room again until he says otherwise." Celine sank onto the edge of her bed, her mind racing. Someone outside the castle already knew enough to send a stranger searching specifically for her. Someone believed she was important enough to risk infiltrating a king's own fortress. She thought again of the symbol hidden behind the loose stone, of Agnes's warnings, of Lord Voss's careful, probing questions in the garden. Whatever secret her bloodline carried, it seemed the world beyond these walls already knew far more about it than she did herself. And for the first time since arriving at Blackthorn Castle, Celine understood that her prison was not simply the tower Draven had locked her in. It was the only thing, perhaps, standing between her and something far more dangerous waiting outside its walls. The stranger from the eastern wall was gone by morning, taken to the dungeons beneath the castle, and by the time the sun rose fully over Blackthorn, Lord Cassian Voss had already spent 3 hours going through every record his office possessed, searching for anything that might explain why an infiltrator would risk his life simply to locate the king's new bride. He found nothing in the official archives. That, in itself, told him something. Voss had served this kingdom long enough to know that when the official records were empty, the true answers often lived in older places, forgotten libraries and half-burned scrolls stored away by kings who no longer sat on any throne. He made his way to the lower archive, a cold stone chamber beneath the castle's western wing, rarely visited except by scholars and the occasional curious historian. It took him most of the day to find what he was looking for, buried beneath layers of dust and neglect, a scroll so old its edges crumbled at the lightest touch. It described, in careful, formal language, the founding pact of the Blackthorn throne, written centuries before the first Ashworth king ever wore the crown. Voss read it 3 times before he allowed himself to believe what it said. The throne was never meant to belong to an Alpha bloodline alone. The original pact bound 2 lines together, Alpha and Omega, in a bond recognized not simply by marriage, but by something older, something the scroll called the true joining, a bond that could only occur between an Alpha of the ruling line and an Omega, descended from the founding pact's other half. Without that bond, the scroll warned, any king's claim to the throne remained incomplete, vulnerable to challenge by any rival who could prove a stronger connection to the old agreement. Voss set the scroll down, with hands that were not entirely steady. He thought of Celine Marlowe standing in the garden, her careful, guarded answers when he asked about her bloodline, the flicker of something in her eyes when he mentioned old stories, older than the current treaty. He thought of the stranger who had risked capture, and worse, simply to find her tower. Someone else already knew what this scroll described. Someone else had already guessed, or perhaps confirmed, that the Omega locked away in Draven's tower was not simply an unwanted bride from a disgraced pack. She might be the missing half of a pact that could make or unmake the entire Blackthorn throne. Voss did not go immediately to the king. He told himself it was caution, the same caution that had kept him alive and useful through 3 different reigns. But if he was honest with himself, some small, ambitious part of his mind was already calculating what such knowledge might be worth, and to whom. He decided, for now, to watch and wait. Meanwhile, Draven spent the morning in his war room, questioning the captured infiltrator himself, though the man gave little beyond desperate denials and vague claims of being hired by an unnamed employer for an unnamed purpose. Draven left the interrogation more frustrated than when he entered, his mind circling back, again and again, to the same unanswered question. Why Celine? He found himself climbing the tower stairs earlier than usual that evening, before he had even decided consciously to visit her. When the guards let him in, he found her sitting by the fire, a book open on her lap that she was clearly not reading, her eyes distant and troubled. "You should be resting," he said, though his voice held none of the coldness it once carried in this room. "How can I rest when someone tried to find me last night?" she asked, closing the book. "Elsie told me. A stranger, searching specifically for the king's new bride." Draven sat, unbidden, in the chair across from her, a gesture that surprised them both. "I do not yet know who sent him, or why," he admitted, "but I intend to find out. You said before that you locked me in this tower to protect the kingdom from me," Celine said quietly. "Yet last night, someone came here specifically for me. Perhaps the tower was never protecting your kingdom at all, Your Majesty. Perhaps it was protecting me." Draven's eyes met hers, something shifting behind the steel gray, something almost like guilt. "Perhaps I was wrong about several things," he said quietly. Silence stretched between them, not entirely uncomfortable, filled instead with the crackle of the fire, and the weight of things neither of them yet understood. "Tell me about the symbols," Draven said finally. "The ones the woman who raised you taught you before she died." Celine hesitated only a moment before rising and walking to the wardrobe. She pulled it slightly away from the wall, pressed on the loose stone until it gave way, and reached inside for the small object she had hidden there since her first night in the tower, the ring Agnes had given her, carved with the same symbol etched into the hollow behind the stone. She held it out to him, resting in her open palm. "This belonged to my grandmother, and her grandmother before her, passed down through every generation of Omega women in my family, for as long as anyone can remember. Agnes always said, it marked us as something important, though she died before she could explain what." Draven took the ring carefully, turning it in the firelight, his expression growing more intense with every passing second. "This symbol," he said slowly, "I have seen it only once before, carved into a scroll in the castle archive, describing the founding pact of this very throne." Celine's breath caught. "What does it mean?" "I do not fully know," Draven admitted, "but I intend to find out, tonight, with Voss's help." He paused, studying her with an expression that had lost every trace of the suspicion he once carried into this room. "Celine, if there is any truth to what I suspect, then everything I believed about why you were sent to me may be wrong. You may not be a threat to my throne at all. Then what am I?" Draven's eyes held hers, steady and searching. "You may be the only thing standing between me and losing it entirely." Before Celine could respond, a sharp knock sounded at the door, urgent and rapid. Draven rose instantly, every trace of softness vanishing back into the alert readiness of a king. He opened the door, to find one of his personal guards, breathless, his face pale with alarm. "Your Majesty," the guard said. "Lord Voss requests your presence immediately. He says he has found something in the archives that cannot wait until morning." Draven glanced back at Celine, and for the first time since her arrival, she saw something other than distance in his eyes when he looked at her. It looked almost like an apology. "Stay here," he said. "I will return as soon as I can, and this time, I will tell you everything I learn." He left, and the door locked behind him. But for the first time since arriving at Blackthorn Castle, Celine did not feel entirely like a prisoner. She felt, instead, like someone standing at the edge of a truth far larger than herself, a truth that had been waiting, patiently, hidden in stone and blood and old symbols, for exactly this moment, to finally begin to surface. Outside, the wind carried the scent of rain across the mountains once more, and somewhere in the archive below, two men, who had spent their lives serving a throne built on secrets, were about to discover just how deep those secrets truly ran. The archive smelled of dust and old parchment, and by the time Draven arrived, Voss had already spread 3 separate scrolls across the long stone table, each one older and more fragile than the last. "Your Majesty," Voss said, straightening quickly, though his eyes carried a weight Draven had rarely seen in him before. "I believe I have found the answer to why an infiltrator would risk his life searching for your bride." Draven crossed the room and studied the scrolls, though the faded script meant little to him without explanation. "Tell me." Voss recounted what he had discovered, the founding pact, the joining of 2 bloodlines, Alpha and Omega, the warning that any king who ruled without completing that bond ruled on a foundation that could be challenged and broken by a rival with a stronger claim. He explained, carefully, watching Draven's face for reaction, that the symbol carved into these scrolls matched, in every detail, the one Draven had just seen on a ring belonging to Celine Marlowe. "You believe she carries the missing bloodline," Draven said slowly. "I believe it is possible, Your Majesty, and if it is possible, then others may believe it too. That would explain the infiltrator. It would explain why a woman from an unremarkable, disgraced pack was suddenly deemed important enough for a stranger to risk capture, simply to locate her." Draven's mind raced, pulling together threads that had confused him since the moment Celine arrived. His own advisors had pushed hard for this particular marriage, insisting it fulfilled the old treaty requirements exactly, though at the time he had assumed it was simply the closest match available among the border packs. Now he wondered if someone, somewhere, had known far more about Celine's bloodline than they had ever admitted to him. "Who else has access to these archives?" Draven asked. "Very few," Voss said. "Myself, the royal historian, and of course, anyone with a key, granted directly by the crown." He paused, choosing his next words with visible care. "Your Majesty, I must ask, who selected Lady Celine as your bride? Was it your own council, or was there outside influence in that decision?" Draven's jaw tightened as memory sharpened into focus. "My uncle," he said slowly. "Regent Malachi proposed her family specifically, insisting they were the most appropriate match remaining among the border packs bound by treaty." Voss said nothing, but something careful and uneasy passed behind his eyes. "Speak plainly, Voss," Draven said. "I have no patience left for careful words tonight." "I only wonder, Your Majesty, why your uncle would push so specifically for a pack as obscure as the Marlows, when several other, more prominent options existed within the treaty's requirements. If he knew of Celine's bloodline, and chose her deliberately." He did not finish the thought. He did not need to. Draven stood very still, his mind working through implications that felt, suddenly, far more dangerous than any external threat at his gates. If his own uncle had known about the bloodline and arranged the marriage anyway, it raised a question far more troubling than any infiltrator from a rival kingdom. Why would Malachi want an unbonded, powerless Omega with a legitimate claim locked away in a tower, isolated from the very bond that might complete her power, rather than simply ensuring she never arrived at Blackthorn Castle at all? Unless keeping her close, powerless, and unbonded served some purpose of his own. "I need to speak with Celine again," Draven said abruptly, already moving toward the door. "Voss, say nothing of this to anyone until I return. Not to the council, not to my uncle. No one." "Of course, Your Majesty." Draven climbed the tower stairs 2 at a time, his mind a storm of half-formed suspicions he was not yet ready to fully believe. When the guards led him into Celine's room, he found her still awake, sitting by the fire exactly where he had left her, though something in her posture suggested she had been waiting, tense and alert, for his return. "What did you learn?" she asked immediately. Draven sat across from her again, and this time he did not hesitate before speaking honestly. "The scrolls confirm what I suspected. Your bloodline may be tied to the founding pact of this throne, the missing half of a bond required to make any king's rule complete and unchallengeable." He paused. "I also learned something else. My uncle, Regent Malachi, specifically proposed your family for this marriage, despite several more prominent options existing within the treaty's requirements." Celine's expression shifted from confusion to slow, dawning alarm. "You believe he knew?" "I believe it is possible he knew exactly what your bloodline meant, and arranged this marriage deliberately," Draven said. "What I do not yet understand is why. If he wanted to use your claim against me, keeping you unbonded and isolated in a tower would prevent that claim from ever being completed." "Unless he did not want the claim completed at all," Celine said slowly, her mind working through the same dark logic. "Unless he wanted me here, close enough to control, far enough from you to ensure our bond never formed, keeping the throne permanently vulnerable, permanently incomplete, until he found the right moment to use that weakness for himself." Draven's expression darkened, the pieces settling into a shape he did not want to see, but could no longer deny. "If that is true, then locking you away in this tower did not protect my throne at all," he said quietly. It may have played directly into exactly what my uncle intended. Celine studied him carefully, watching the weight of that realization settle over him, the guilt and fury warring behind his steel-gray eyes. Then we must decide what to do next, she said, surprising them both with the steadiness of her voice. Not as king and prisoner, your majesty. As two people who have just discovered the same enemy hiding closer than either of us realized. Draven met her eyes, and for the first time since she arrived at Blackthorn Castle, something passed between them that felt less like suspicion, and more like the fragile, cautious beginning of trust. I owe you an apology, he said quietly. For the tower, for the guards, for every assumption I made about you before I understood anything true. You can apologize later, your majesty, Celine said, a faint, tired smile touching her lips, despite the fear still coursing beneath her calm exterior. Right now, I think we have a regent to investigate. Draven almost smiled back, the expression unfamiliar and strange on a face that had carried nothing but cold command for so long. Agreed, he said, but carefully. If Malachi suspects we know anything, he will move against us before we are ready to move against him. Outside the tower window, the moon had risen high above Blackthorn Castle, casting pale light across a kingdom that believed its throne stood on solid ground, unaware that far below, in the quiet dark of an old archive, and here, in a tower meant to be a prison, the true foundation of that throne had just begun, quietly and carefully, to shift. The scream came just before midnight, sharp and sudden, cutting through the quiet of the tower like a blade. Celine bolted upright in bed, heart pounding, uncertain for a moment whether the sound had come from a dream or from somewhere real. Then she heard it again, closer this time, a servant's voice, raised in terror somewhere on the floor below, followed by the heavy thud of running footsteps and the clash of steel against steel. She threw off the blankets and rushed to the door, pressing her ear against the cold wood, straining to understand what was happening. The guards who were always stationed outside her room were shouting now, their calm discipline broken by urgency she had never heard from them before. Intruder, one of them yelled. West stair, moving fast. Celine's blood went cold. She backed away from the door, glancing wildly around the room for anything she might use to defend herself, though she had no training, no weapon, nothing but a fireplace poker and a desperate hope that the guards outside would hold. The door burst open before she could decide what to do. A figure stood in the doorway, dressed in dark clothing that blended with the shadows, a hood pulled low over a face she could not see. Behind him, one of her guards lay crumpled on the floor of the corridor, unmoving. Celine's breath caught in her throat as the intruder stepped inside, closing the door quietly behind him, as though he had all the time in the world, despite the chaos he had just left in his wake. You are difficult to reach, the man said, his voice low and unfamiliar, carrying an accent Celine did not recognize from anywhere in the Blackthorn Kingdom. For someone so carefully hidden, your king does not guard you nearly well enough. Who are you? Celine demanded, backing toward the window, gripping the fireplace poker with both hands. It does not matter who I am, the man said, taking a slow step closer. What matters is what you carry in your blood, and the fact that certain people would prefer it never reaches its full potential. His hand moved toward something hidden at his belt, and Celine's grip tightened on the poker, every muscle in her body coiled with fear and readiness. The door burst open again, and this time it was Draven who filled the doorway, his expression a mask of pure fury, a blade already drawn in his hand. The intruder spun to face him, but he had barely turned, before Draven crossed the room, in 3 long strides, moving with a speed and precision that spoke of years of training beneath his usual controlled composure. The fight was brief and brutal, though Celine, pressed against the wall near the window, could barely track the movement, steel flashing in the firelight. The intruder's desperate attempts to break free, met at every turn by Draven's relentless, focused strength. It ended with the intruder pinned against the floor, Draven's blade at his throat, both men breathing hard in the sudden, ringing silence that followed. Who sent you? Draven demanded, his voice low and dangerous. The intruder said nothing, his eyes darting toward Celine with an expression she could not quite read, something between fear and grim satisfaction, as though he had already accepted whatever fate awaited him. Guards, Draven called, and 2 soldiers rushed into the room, quickly securing the intruder and pulling him away. though his eyes stayed locked on Celine until the moment he was dragged from the room entirely. The moment they were gone, Draven turned to her, and for the first time since she had known him, she saw something in his eyes that looked entirely unguarded, raw, and unmistakable. "Are you hurt?" he asked, crossing the room to her in 2 quick steps, his hands hovering near her shoulders as though he wanted to check for injury, but was uncertain whether he had the right to touch her. "I am fine," Celine said, though her voice trembled slightly, the aftermath of fear finally catching up with her now that the danger had passed. "He said something about my blood, about certain people preferring it never reaches its full potential." Draven's expression darkened further. "The Cade Dominion has spies throughout the border regions," he said grimly. "If they learned of your bloodline before we did, they would have every reason to eliminate you before that bloodline could ever be joined with mine. A completed bond would make my throne far stronger than any claim they could bring against it. So they would rather see me dead than risk that bond forming," Celine said quietly, the reality of the statement settling heavily over her. "Not while I live," Draven said, his voice fierce with a certainty that surprised them both. "I will not allow it." Celine studied him carefully, searching his face for the calculation she had expected from a king protecting a political asset, but finding instead something that looked far more personal, far more instinctive than strategy alone could explain. "Why does this matter so much to you?" she asked quietly. "A week ago, you would have called my death a convenient solution to a political inconvenience." Draven was silent for a long moment, his jaw tight, his eyes searching hers with an intensity that made her breath catch. "A week ago, I did not know you," he said finally. "I knew only a stranger sent by treaty, someone I assumed carried danger I could not yet name. I did not expect—" He paused, seeming to search for words that did not come easily to a man who had spent years guarding every thought behind careful command. "I did not expect to feel the way I felt tonight, watching that man stand between you and the door. I have not felt fear like that since the day my father died." Celine's heart pounded for reasons that had nothing to do with the intruder now locked away in the castle's dungeons. "Draven," she said softly, using his name for the first time since her arrival, the word feeling strange and significant on her tongue. He looked at her, something raw and unguarded passing across his features, and for a moment, neither of them spoke. The silence stretched taut between them, filled with everything neither was yet ready to say aloud. "I will double the guards on this tower," he said finally, stepping back, though the distance seemed to cost him something. "And I will speak with Voss about accelerating our investigation into my uncle. Whoever sent that man knew details about you that only someone within these walls could have provided." Celine's eyes widened. "You believe Malachi is working with the Cade Dominion?" "I do not yet know," Draven admitted. "But I intend to find out, and soon, before another attempt reaches closer to succeeding than tonight's did." He moved toward the door, then paused, looking back at her with an expression that lingered somewhere between duty and something far warmer. "Rest, if you can. I will post guards I trust completely outside this door tonight, men who answer to me alone." He left, and Celine sat by the fire for a long time afterward, her hands still trembling slightly, her mind circling back again and again to the fierce, unguarded fear she had seen in Draven's eyes. Fear that had nothing to do with politics, or thrones, or ancient bloodlines, and everything to do, she suspected, with something far simpler, and far more dangerous to a king who had sworn never to trust anyone again. Somewhere deep beneath the castle, in a cold stone cell, the captured intruder sat in silence, refusing to speak despite hours of questioning, his eyes fixed on the darkness, waiting patiently for a rescue he was certain would come, sent by someone far more powerful than the guards who thought they had already won. The intruder was dead by morning. Draven received the news standing in his war room, the messenger's voice carefully neutral, as he explained that the prisoner had been found in his cell, poisoned by a substance no guard could account for, his lips already turning blue by the time anyone noticed something was wrong. There had been no visitors overnight. There had been no gaps in the guard rotation, and yet, somehow, a man locked deep beneath Blackthorn Castle, surrounded by loyal soldiers, had been silenced before he could reveal a single useful word. Draven's hands curled into fists at his sides. "Someone within these walls did this," he said quietly. "Yes, Your Majesty," the messenger agreed, not daring to suggest anything further. Draven dismissed him and stood alone for a long moment, staring at the map spread across his war table. The borders of his kingdom marked in careful ink, the mountains and rivers and packlands he had sworn to protect since the day his father died and left the crown too suddenly on shoulders that had not yet finished growing into it. He thought of Voss, working late into the archive with careful, patient hands. He thought of his uncle, Regent Malachi, who had served as advisor and guardian since Draven's childhood, who had stood beside him through every crisis, every difficult decision, every moment of grief when the throne felt too heavy to bear alone. He did not want to believe what the evidence increasingly suggested, but a king who ignored evidence out of loyalty was a king who did not survive long. He summoned Voss immediately, and the two men spoke for nearly an hour behind closed doors, comparing everything they knew: the timing of Celine's marriage proposal, the specific push for her particular pack despite better options, the intruder's knowledge of her exact location within the castle, and now, his sudden and convenient death before he could name whoever had sent him. "We need proof," Draven said finally. "Suspicion alone will not be enough to move against a man as respected and deeply embedded in this court as my uncle." "Then we must find proof carefully," Voss said. "If Malachi suspects we are watching him, he will simply become more careful, and we may never catch him again." They agreed to proceed quietly, watching Malachi's movements without confronting him directly, gathering evidence piece by piece until they held enough to act without risking a court divided by accusation alone. Celine, meanwhile, found herself granted more freedom than she had known since arriving at Blackthorn Castle, though it came wrapped in careful new precautions. She was permitted to walk the garden daily, always with trusted guards close at hand, and twice that week, Draven himself joined her, walking slow circles around the fountain, while they spoke quietly of things that had nothing to do with thrones or bloodlines at all. She learned that he had lost his mother when he was young, that his father had raised him with more discipline than warmth, that he had taken the crown far earlier than any king should, at just 20 years old, when his father's heart failed suddenly during a hunting trip in the northern mountains. She learned that he loved horses more than he loved court politics, that he had once wanted, as a boy, to travel beyond the kingdom's borders, simply to see what lay past the mountains he had spent his whole life staring at from his tower window. In return, she told him about Agnes, about the small cottage at the edge of the Marlow lands, about evenings spent listening to old stories by candlelight that she had never fully understood until now. She told him about her parents, who had died when she was too young to remember them clearly, leaving her raised entirely by a grandmother figure who was not truly her grandmother at all, simply an old Omega elder entrusted, she now suspected, with protecting a bloodline whose full importance even Agnes herself might not have completely understood. "She always seemed to be waiting for something," Celine said one afternoon, sitting beside Draven on a stone bench near the fountain, as though she knew a moment like this one was coming, even if she never lived to see it. "I wish I could have met her," Draven said quietly. "She would have liked you," Celine said, surprising herself with the certainty in her own voice. "Once she stopped glaring at you for locking me in a tower, at least." Draven laughed, a real laugh, unguarded and warm, a sound Celine suspected few people in this castle had ever heard from their king. "I deserve that," he admitted. "I was wrong about you, Celine. Wrong in nearly every way a man can be wrong." "You were afraid," she said gently. "Betrayal does that to a person. It makes trust feel like the most dangerous thing in the world." He looked at her then, something shifting behind his eyes, quiet and certain. "It is still the most dangerous thing in the world," he said softly. "And yet somehow, with you, it no longer feels like a risk I am unwilling to take." Celine's breath caught, the words settling somewhere deep and warm inside her chest. Before she could find a response, a servant appeared at the garden entrance, bowing quickly. "Your Majesty, Regent Malachi requests an audience. He says it concerns urgent matters regarding the border patrols." Draven's expression shifted instantly back into careful, controlled neutrality, the mask of a king slipping back into place. "Tell him I will be there shortly." He rose, glancing back at Celine with something apologetic in his eyes. "I must go. But Celine, know that whatever comes next, whatever we uncover about my uncle, you are no longer someone I intend to keep locked away out of fear. You are someone I intend to protect, and to trust, for as long as you allow me to." He left, and Celine sat alone by the fountain for a long while afterward, Watching the water ripple in slow, quiet circles, her heart caught somewhere between hope and the lingering fear of everything still unresolved: the poisoned prisoner, the missing proof against a regent who had raised a king since childhood, the ancient bond that waited, patient and unclaimed, for two people who had only just begun to trust each other enough to consider it. That evening, deep in the castle's private study, Regent Malachi poured himself a glass of dark wine and watched the fire with calm, unhurried patience, his mind already several steps ahead of the king and advisor, who believed they were investigating him in secret. He had survived 3 reigns through careful, patient planning, and he did not intend to let one clever advisor and one increasingly suspicious nephew undo decades of quiet preparation now, not when the throne itself was so close to finally, truly, becoming his own. Voss found the letter 3 weeks later, hidden inside a false panel at the back of a records cabinet in the regent's private office, discovered only because Malachi had left for a hunting trip in the Northern Territories, and Voss had used the opportunity to search the office thoroughly, while its occupant was safely away from the castle. The letter was written in a careful, coded hand, but Voss had spent enough years studying old ciphers to recognize the pattern within minutes. Once decoded, the message left no room for doubt. It was addressed to an unnamed contact within the Cade Dominion, dated weeks before Celine's marriage was even arranged, describing in careful detail the existence of an obscure Omega bloodline tied to the Blackthorn founding pact, and proposing an arrangement that would benefit both parties. Malachi would ensure the bride arrived at Blackthorn Castle and remained isolated, unbonded, and powerless. In exchange, the Cade Dominion would support Malachi's eventual claim to the throne once Draven had been discredited, removed, or otherwise made to appear unfit to rule, using the very existence of a hidden, unbonded bloodline as proof that the current king had knowingly kept dangerous secrets from his own court. Voss read the letter twice, his hands unsteady, before folding it carefully and hiding it inside his robes. He needed to reach Draven immediately. He found the king in the war room, reviewing reports from the border patrols, and the moment Voss entered, his expression alone communicated that something significant had changed. "You found something," Draven said, setting down the reports. Voss produced the letter and explained everything, watching Draven's face shift from careful attention to disbelief, to something colder and far more dangerous as the full weight of his uncle's betrayal settled into place. When Voss finished, Draven stood in silence for a long moment, staring at the decoded letter in his hands, reading his uncle's careful, calculated treachery in black ink. "He raised me," Draven said quietly, his voice tight with a fury that seemed to be fighting against genuine grief underneath. "He stood beside me when my father died. He taught me how to rule, how to lead, how to survive in a court full of people who wanted to see me fail. And this entire time, he was planning your downfall." Voss finished gently. "I am sorry, Your Majesty. I know this is not easy to hear." Draven's jaw tightened, his hand crumpling the letter slightly, before he forced himself to smooth it flat again, preserving the evidence. "Where is he now?" "Still in the Northern Territories, Your Majesty. Expected to return within the week." "Then we have time to prepare," Draven said, his voice hardening into the controlled focus of a king planning for war. "We cannot move against him. Without absolute certainty, this letter will hold as proof before the full court. He has allies among several noble families, who will not accept his removal without undeniable evidence." "What do you propose?" Draven's eyes moved toward the window, toward the tower, where Celine remained, unaware of the danger now confirmed to be circling far closer than either of them had originally feared. "I propose we let him believe his plan is still working," he said slowly. "We continue as though nothing has changed. We give him no reason to suspect we have found proof of his treachery, and in the meantime, we prepare exactly how we intend to expose him, publicly, undeniably, in front of the entire court, so that no ally he holds can dismiss what he has done." Voss nodded slowly, though concern remained evident in his expression. "And Lady Celine? If your uncle believes his plan is proceeding, he may grow desperate to ensure she remains unbonded and isolated. He may attempt something more direct." Draven's expression darkened further. "Then we ensure he never has the opportunity." That evening, Draven climbed the tower stairs with a weight in his chest he had not felt since the day his father died. He found Celine sitting by the window, watching the last light fade over the mountains, and something in his expression must have told her immediately that the news he carried was serious. "What happened?" she asked, rising from her chair. Draven told her everything: the letter, the coded message, his uncle's careful plan stretching back weeks before her marriage was even arranged. He watched her face carefully as he spoke, expecting fear, perhaps anger, but instead, he saw something closer to quiet, steady resolve settle over her features as she absorbed the full scope of the betrayal. "He wanted me isolated," she said slowly, working through the logic aloud. "Unbonded, powerless. Not because my bloodline threatened your throne, but because an unbonded, unclaimed heir left the throne permanently vulnerable, a weakness he could expose and exploit whenever it served him best." "Yes," Draven confirmed. "Then the solution seems clear enough," Celine said, meeting his eyes with a steadiness that surprised them both. "We complete the bond. We remove the very weakness he has spent so long trying to preserve." Draven's breath caught. "Celine, I do not want you to feel forced into this decision because of politics, or danger, or anything other than your own genuine choice. A bond like this cannot be undone. It is not a political arrangement I am asking you to accept out of necessity." "I know what it is," Celine said softly, closing the distance between them, until she stood close enough to see every flicker of emotion crossing his carefully guarded face. "And I am not agreeing to it because of your uncle, or the throne, or the ancient pact written on scrolls neither of us fully understand yet. I am agreeing because somewhere between the tower and the garden and the fear we have shared these past weeks, I stopped seeing you as a king I was forced to marry, and started seeing you as someone I choose, freely, for reasons that have nothing to do with bloodlines or politics at all." Draven reached up, his hand cupping her face with a gentleness that felt like an apology for every cold word he had spoken during her first days in this castle. "Then let us face whatever comes next together," he said quietly. "As equals, as partners, not as a king protecting his throne, and not as a prisoner trapped within it, but as two people who have finally found something worth trusting, in a world that gave neither of us many reasons to trust at all." Outside the tower window, the last light faded fully into darkness, and somewhere in the northern territories, Regent Malachi sat by his own fire, entirely unaware that the careful, patient plan he had spent years constructing was about to collide, sooner than he expected, with a king and an Omega who had finally chosen to stand together against him. The bonding ceremony was arranged quietly, far from the public eye, held in a small chapel within the castle grounds that had not seen a royal bonding in nearly 2 generations. Only Voss and a handful of trusted guards were present, along with an elder priestess summoned from the Packlands, sworn to secrecy, until Draven and Celine decided the time was right to reveal what had happened. Celine stood at the chapel altar in a simple gown, her hands trembling slightly as the priestess began the old words, ancient even by the standards of the founding pact itself, words that spoke of blood joining blood, of 2 lines becoming one, of a bond that could not be broken by treaty, or politics, or the careful schemes of any regent, however patient his planning had been. Draven stood across from her, his eyes steady on hers throughout the entire ceremony, and when the moment came for the bond to be sealed, he took her hand gently, his thumb tracing careful circles against her palm, a small, private comfort meant only for her. "Are you certain?" he whispered, one final time, giving her every opportunity to change her mind. "I have never been more certain of anything," Celine whispered back. The bond settled between them like something ancient waking after a long, patient sleep, a warmth that spread through Celine's chest and outward through every part of her, a sense of connection so profound it nearly stole the breath from her lungs. She felt, in that moment, something she could not fully explain, an awareness of Draven that went beyond simple affection, a recognition deep in her blood that matched exactly what Agnes had always hinted at without ever fully explaining. Draven's eyes widened slightly, clearly feeling something similar on his end of the bond, a connection neither of them had anticipated could feel quite this powerful, quite this immediate. When the ceremony ended, the priestess bowed low before them both. "The pact is fulfilled," she said quietly. "The throne stands whole once more, for the first time in generations." They kept the bonding secret for exactly 4 days, using that time to finalize every detail of the plan to expose Malachi. gathering additional evidence, arranging for key allies among the noble families to be present when the truth was finally revealed. Voss worked tirelessly, confirming the letter's authenticity through careful comparison with other documents known to bear Malachi's private seal, ensuring that when the moment came, no ally of the regent could dismiss the evidence as forgery or misunderstanding. On the fifth day, word arrived that Malachi had returned from the northern territories and intended to address the full court the following morning, claiming urgent news regarding threats to the crown that required immediate action. Draven and Selene exchanged a knowing look when the message reached them. Whatever Malachi intended to reveal, they suspected it would not simply be news of border threats. "He knows something has changed," Selene said quietly, standing beside Draven in the war room as they reviewed final preparations for the following day. "Perhaps he has spies watching the tower. Perhaps he noticed the chapel activity 4 days ago." "It does not matter what he knows," Draven said, his voice steady with the calm resolve of a king who had finally stopped running from difficult truths. "Tomorrow, we control the narrative. Whatever he intends to claim, we will be ready to answer with proof he cannot deny." That night, Selene lay awake in the chambers she now shared with Draven, no longer confined to the isolated tower, but moved instead to rooms befitting a bonded queen, her hand resting lightly against Draven's chest, feeling the steady rhythm of his heartbeat beneath her palm. "Whatever happens tomorrow," she said quietly into the darkness, "I am glad it happened this way. I am glad I came to know you, before either of us understood what we truly were to each other." Draven's arm tightened gently around her. "So am I," he murmured. "Though I still owe you countless apologies for every cold word I spoke during your first days here." "You have already apologized enough," Selene said, a faint smile touching her voice, despite the tension of what awaited them at dawn. "Tomorrow, let us simply focus on making certain no one takes this bond, or this throne, away from us." They fell into an uneasy sleep eventually, wrapped together against whatever the morning might bring, while far below in his private chambers, Regent Malachi reviewed his own careful plans for the court's morning session, entirely unaware that the very weakness he had spent so long working to preserve had already been resolved, quietly and completely, 4 nights before his return. The great hall was filled to capacity by mid-morning. Nobles and advisors and representatives from every major pack within the Blackthorn Kingdom gathered beneath the tall stone arches, drawn by word that the regent intended to address a matter of urgent importance to the crown. Draven sat upon the throne with careful, practiced calm, though beneath his composed exterior, every muscle remained tense with readiness for whatever his uncle intended to reveal. Selene stood beside him, not seated on any throne of her own yet, dressed in deep royal blue, her bearing steady, despite the whispers that rippled through the crowd at her unexpected presence in the hall. Few among the nobility had ever seen the king's mysterious bride, kept hidden away in her tower for weeks, and her sudden appearance beside the throne sparked immediate, curious murmurs throughout the assembled court. Regent Malachi entered with the confident, measured stride of a man who believed he still controlled every thread of the situation about to unfold. He bowed before the throne with practiced respect, then turned to address the full court, his voice carrying easily through the vast stone hall. "Your Majesty, honored lords and ladies," he began, "I come before you today with grave news. I have discovered that our king has knowingly harbored a dangerous secret within these very walls, a secret that threatens the legitimacy of the Blackthorn throne itself." Gasps and murmurs spread through the hall. Draven's expression remained carefully neutral, giving nothing away. "The woman he married," Malachi continued, gesturing toward Selene with theatrical concern, "carries a bloodline tied to an ancient, forgotten pact, one that claims any king who fails to properly bond with such a bloodline rules on an incomplete, illegitimate foundation. Our king has known this for weeks and kept it hidden, isolating her in a tower, rather than addressing the matter honestly before this court. I ask you, my lords, what other secrets has our king kept from those he claims to serve?" The hall erupted into anxious muttering, exactly as Malachi had clearly intended. He raised his hands for silence, then continued, his voice growing more forceful. "I propose that a king who deceives his own court cannot be trusted to rule wisely. I propose that until this matter is fully resolved, and the legitimacy of the throne properly restored, a regency council should assume temporary authority, led by myself, until the situation can be The situation has already been resolved, Draven said, rising from the throne, his voice cutting cleanly through the regent's carefully rehearsed speech. Malachi's confident expression flickered, just slightly, before he recovered his composure. Your Majesty, I do not understand. You understand perfectly well, Uncle, Draven said, descending the throne steps slowly, his eyes never leaving Malachi's face. You understand because you arranged my marriage to Celine Marlowe specifically because you discovered her bloodline months ago, and you believed that keeping her unbonded and isolated would leave my throne permanently vulnerable. A weakness you intended to exploit exactly as you are attempting to exploit it now. The hall fell into stunned silence. Malachi's face paled slightly, though he attempted to maintain his composure. Your Majesty, these are serious accusations without any proof? Draven interrupted, nodding toward Voss, who stepped forward from the edge of the hall carrying a sealed document. Lord Voss discovered a letter in your private study, written in your own coded hand, addressed to a contact within the Cade Dominion, proposing exactly the arrangement I have just described. Your seal, Uncle, your handwriting, your betrayal, laid bare in ink you believed no one would ever find. Voss unrolled the letter and read it aloud before the full court, the decoded message ringing clearly through the stone hall, leaving no room for doubt or interpretation. The color drained entirely from Malachi's face, as murmurs of shock and outrage spread rapidly through the assembled nobles. This is fabricated, Malachi said, though his voice had lost much of its earlier confidence. A forgery, designed to discredit me. The seal has been verified against a dozen other documents bearing your authentic mark, Voss said calmly. 3 separate scribes have confirmed the handwriting matches your own correspondence from the same period. This is no fabrication, my lord, and I suspect you know that better than anyone in this hall. Draven raised his hand, and Celine stepped forward to stand beside him, close enough that the entire court could see clearly the bond that now connected them, visible in the way they moved together, the quiet certainty in both their postures. The bond my uncle worked so hard to prevent has already been completed, Draven announced, his voice carrying clearly through the silent hall. 5 nights ago, Celine Marlowe and I completed the ancient pact before witnesses and a priestess of the old ways. The throne of Blackthorn stands whole and legitimate, exactly as it should, and the weakness my uncle spent years cultivating no longer exists. The hall erupted into a mixture of astonished murmurs and, gradually, scattered applause from nobles who had long respected the crown and had no love for a regent whose ambition had clearly outgrown his loyalty. Malachi's expression shifted rapidly from disbelief to something colder, more desperate. You cannot simply— I can, and I have, Draven said firmly. Regent Malachi, you are hereby stripped of your title and all authority within this court, effective immediately. You will be held under guard while the full extent of your dealings with the Cade Dominion is investigated. Any further attempts to challenge this throne will be met with the full consequences your betrayal deserves. Guards moved forward at Draven's signal, flanking Malachi on either side. For a moment, the former regent's eyes flashed with something dangerous, calculating, as though searching desperately for one final move that might salvage his failing plan. Then, slowly, the fight drained from his posture, replaced by the resigned bitterness of a man who understood, finally, that his carefully constructed scheme had crumbled entirely. You will regret this, Malachi said quietly, his eyes locked on Draven as the guards led him away. The Cade Dominion will not simply accept this outcome quietly. Then let them come, Draven said, his voice steady and unshaken. They will find a throne far stronger than they anticipated, standing whole and united, exactly as it was always meant to be. The hall watched in stunned silence as the former regent was led from the chamber, the weight of weeks of careful scheming finally, completely undone. Celine felt Draven's hand find hers, steady and warm, and she understood, standing there before the full court, that whatever challenges still remained ahead, they would face them together, bonded not simply by ancient pact, but by a trust neither of them had expected to find, in a marriage that began with locked doors and cold silence. Snow had begun to fall over Blackthorn Castle by the time the kingdom finally settled into its new peace. Soft white flakes drifting past the tower windows Celine had once stared through with nothing but despair, transformed now into the quiet, contented view from the private study she shared with the man who had once locked her away out of fear. Malachi's trial had concluded 3 weeks after his public exposure, his connections to the Cade Dominion fully confirmed through additional evidence uncovered during the investigation that followed his arrest. He was stripped permanently of any noble title, his lands seized by the crown, and exiled beyond the kingdom's borders under strict watch, forbidden from ever returning to Blackthorn territory again. The Cade Dominion, faced with a throne now standing whole and legitimate, withdrew their support quietly, unwilling to risk open conflict against a bonded king and queen, whose claim could no longer be challenged by any rival, however patient or well-prepared. The court, once wary and uncertain of the mysterious bride kept hidden in a tower, had come to embrace Selene fully in the months that followed, drawn by her quiet strength, her steady compassion toward the servants and common folk who had once feared even speaking her name aloud, and the visible, undeniable devotion between her and the king that no one who spent time in their presence could doubt for even a moment. Draven had changed too, in ways the older nobles who remembered his father's reign found remarkable. The cold, guarded suspicion that had once defined every interaction with his court had softened, not entirely, for a king still needed careful instincts to rule wisely, but enough that his people had begun to see, for the first time since he took the crown at 20 years old, a ruler capable of genuine warmth, alongside genuine strength. On a quiet evening in late winter, Selene stood at the window of their shared chambers, watching snow settle over the mountains beyond the castle walls, the same mountains she had once stared at from a locked tower, wondering if she would ever be permitted to see them up close. Draven's arms wrapped gently around her from behind, his chin resting against the top of her head, and for a long moment neither of them spoke, content simply to stand together in comfortable silence. "Do you ever think about that first night?" Selene asked quietly. "When I arrived, and you had me locked away, without even a proper conversation." Draven's arms tightened slightly around her. "Every day," he admitted. "I think about how close I came to losing something I did not yet understand I needed, simply because fear convinced me that trust was too dangerous a risk to take." "You were protecting your kingdom the only way you knew how," Selene said gently. "I understand that now, even if it frightened me at the time." "That does not excuse how I treated you," Draven said. "You deserved honesty from the beginning, not suspicion and locked doors." Selene turned in his arms to face him, her hand resting gently against his chest, exactly over the steady, familiar rhythm of his heartbeat. "We found our way here eventually," she said softly. "Perhaps that matters more than how difficult the path was to reach it." Draven's expression softened, and he pressed a gentle kiss to her forehead, then rested his own forehead against hers, their breath mingling in the quiet warmth of the room. "I love you," he said simply, the words carrying a weight and sincerity that no political marriage could ever have produced on its own. Not because of any ancient pact, or bloodline, or throne that needed securing. "I love you, because somewhere between that tower and this room, you became the one person in this entire kingdom I trust without any hesitation at all." "I love you too," Selene whispered, tears gathering in her eyes, though her smile remained steady and bright. "Even after everything, even after the locked doors and the cold words, and the fear that nearly kept us apart, I would choose this path again, exactly as it happened, simply because it led me here, to you." Outside, the snow continued falling gently over Blackthorn Castle, blanketing the mountains and rooftops in soft, quiet white, while inside, a king who had once ruled through fear and suspicion, and an Omega who had once been imprisoned by that very fear, stood together in the warm firelight, bonded not simply by an ancient pact written centuries before either of them was born, but by a love neither of them had expected to find, forged through hardship and betrayal into something unbreakable. The throne of Blackthorn stood stronger than it had in generations, secured not merely by bloodline or treaty, but by two people who had learned, against every instinct that once told them trust was too dangerous a risk, that the truest strength a kingdom could hold was found not in walls, or guards, or locked towers, but in the quiet, unshakable bond between a king and the queen he had once tried, so desperately and so wrongly, to keep away.